if you're somebody that likes to sit in between problems, right? You sit in between three of the biggest problems in the industry. There's the science, which you have to automate. There's the hardware, which you have to work with. And then there's the software, which you may have to build or interact with or scope out. And so lab automation really kind of sits at the intersection of all three, which is really unique in that sense. So I found that very intellectually satisfying. So, yeah.
Welcome to Discovery Engines, a podcast about the people and platforms who are accelerating scientific discovery. In today's episode, I sit down with Luis Villa, a senior lab automation engineer at cell therapy manufacturing startup Cellares, co-founder of the Bay Area Lab Automators, and a new friend who's been incredibly generous in plugging me and many others into the Bay Area automation and hardware communities. We recorded this interview in South San Francisco, the self-proclaimed birthplace of biotech, starting with the founding of Genentech in 1976. According to the city's website, it's one of the largest biotech clusters in the world, with over 250 biotech companies and 12 million square feet of biotech space. We start this conversation by looking into what a typical workday entails for Luis as a senior lab automation engineer. We then zoom out and look at some bigger themes, such as the state of lab automation today, the challenges of manufacturing cell therapies, the rise of closed-loop or autonomous labs, and the increasing trend of onshoring life science research and manufacturing. If you are thinking of breaking into lab automation or starting a career or studies in that space, if you're just looking to get smart on it, or maybe you're evaluating a startup pitch in the lab automation space, I think you'll find this conversation worth your while. And with that, let's dive in. Luis Villa, thank you so much for coming out today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Excited to be here. Yeah.
So I know you from Bay Area Lab Automators. We met about a year ago, I think around here, at a holiday party that you had. I remember you were wearing a really festive sweater. I was new to San Francisco, just trying to figure out who's doing what, and you were incredibly warm, connected me with a bunch of people at that event, something that I've seen you do over and over again over the last year as I've come to know you.
Was that really the first time we met? Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you also are a full-time automation engineer, so grateful for you on a weekday morning spending some time with me here and telling me more about the world of automation engineering.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here with you, and I'm really excited to just share, and have this conversation, but also be active, right? And so hopefully other people can listen in and form ideas and walk away and reach out to you and have more of these conversations, because I think they're really important to have. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So to kick us off, I know you as this fun, cool, laid-back guy at Bay Area Lab Automators.
Wow, cool, huh? Yeah, I'll take that.
Cool. Yeah.
It's on the record, by the way. Yeah.
But you've got a pretty serious background. So you were at UC Berkeley. You got a BA with a focus in molecular and cell biology. You worked for a life science startup called Natera. I counted 5 promotions there, from research associate to a lead automation engineer. And now you are at a startup in this area called Cellares, or Cellares. And Cellares, which I saw in August 2023, raised $255 million Series 3 to launch what they say is the first integrated development and manufacturing organization / smart factory to help make life-saving cell therapies more accessible. So first, thank you for spending this time with me. As someone who's new and curious about automation engineering, one question I have is just how does one get into this field in the first place? So what first caught your eye about this space and got you interested in working in this space?
Yeah, so I think going back to my undergrad, I think I did genetics, and at the time bioengineering was more biomechanics, biophysics. So I was really looking for something that was more interdisciplinary, and genetics was really big on sort of theory And then a lot of the things that became synthetic biology or computational bio were originally home in these spaces. So I was always really interested in that sort of intersection of, traditional biology and then all these other new digital tools. And I just wasn't aware of like the state of hardware. So I go into take my first job out of college, and I walk in and I'm noticing that we have all of these instruments, and it's just really exciting. I've always liked hardware. Was part of an aerospace club at Berkeley where we built our own planes, and so just kind of made sense to try to see how I could transition. And I think for a lot of people, traditionally in lab automation, you have two paths. Number one is like you are a engineer, let's say mechanical or something, who just happens to fall into lab automation, or you're a biologist who becomes an engineer. And so my path is the biologist, research associate, who basically was insistent on making this career change. So pretty much came in every day, asked questions, networked at my company, and really tried to fundamentally get to what we were doing, what were the tools that we were using, and how were these things being built. So pretty early on, I realized that this is a career you can have, and it's not something you'll get exposed to in undergrad necessarily, at least not at the time. But now you have programs, I think like Carnegie Mellon and others, that do like digital chemistry, that have automated sciences now, and so there's a subset of undergrads today who are graduating with a lot of that experience, which is really cool. Wish we had that, but I did it the old-fashioned way.
So it sounds like it's a field that, what drew your eyes, it's interdisciplinary, it plays with hardware, but it's one that people come into from something else. There's no sort of lab automation track. At least there wasn't when you were, coming up in school. Is that right?
Yeah, and what I really liked about it is, if you're somebody that likes to sit in between problems, right? You sit in between three of the biggest problems in the industry. There's the science, which you have to automate. There's the hardware, which you have to work with. And then there's the software, which you may have to build or interact with or scope out. And so lab automation really kind of sits at the intersection of all three, which is really unique in that sense. So I found that very intellectually satisfying.
Sounds like it would involve a lot of creative problem solving.
It is a lot of creative problem solving, and I think a lot of the really talented lab automation engineers that I know are very cross-disciplinary, very cross-functional in terms of how they work. And it is just, you're totally correct. I think it requires a lot of excellent problem-solving skills. And each problem is different, right? Sometimes you're optimizing for cost, sometimes you're optimizing for speed, sometimes you're optimizing for some other thing. And so I think all of those are considerations. So there's really isn't one form of lab automation. There's always going to be N+1.
So we're in South San Francisco. We're surrounded by these really beautiful, expensive-looking glass buildings with big brands like Genentech and AstraZeneca and so forth on them. We see them driving up the highway, or I do. And they look a bit mysterious. I don't really know what's going on inside. I know there's a lot of like fancy, presumably R&D and wet labs and so forth. But you work around here in one of these buildings. If we had a camera with you for the whole day and we were looking at what Luis does, or other lab automation experts like yourself, how do you spend your day?
Wow. So actually, maybe I should do one of those TikToks, day in the life of, right? Yeah. Be like, this is here's my Starbucks. Actually, we're in the Bay, so you're doing Phil's Coffee or something else. Right. So, yeah. I think it varies, right? It obviously varies on roles. When I was a more junior engineer, it would start with I wake up in the morning, get to work, log into Jira or some other ticketing system, see if we have any fires. Maybe go to a stand-up, head into the lab, heads down, kind of work on potential issues, troubleshoot, and then work on projects. And so that was pretty standard, I'd say. Depending on the teams, you could have these roles being totally bifurcated. So what I liked about my previous team was that we had to wear all the hats. So that means I got to learn not just the software, but the hardware, and then that can inform how I built assays. So that was actually incredibly critical, I think, to my development, and very useful. And that was what my life used to be like. Now it's more around, big picture designing of architectures, or writing software, or reaching out, doing daily stand-ups, things like that. So it's more, design, project planning as a whole. And there is still an engineering component, but I think, depending on how well you've done those first two things, you can really abstract a lot of that work. So big fan of abstractions. And I think it allows you to be not just modular, flexible, smaller, leaner, optimize, all the above. And so a day in the life for me today is wake up at 4 a.m., do some reading, head into the office nice and early, follow up with all the emails, do a daily stand-up, and after the stand-up, work on whatever miscellaneous sprint or projects that we're on, and then check in with some of our stakeholders internally and externally, and basically build. Yeah, it's all about execution. I think a really good senior engineer knows how to execute, and that's kind of what you get paid for. I would say so. So you have to execute, and that could be a wide variety of things. So whatever I have to execute upon that day, that's what I do. Yeah.
4 a.m. I am definitely still sleeping at that time.
I've always woken up early. I love waking up early, and it's just I'll wake up and literally just start reading. I have a backlog of papers that I try to read. My wife likes to say that I collect signal a lot. I'm always collecting signal, and so there's a lot of information out there. The problem with lab automation potentially, or with today, is that there are quite a bit of resources. It's just not highly centralized, and so to really kind of see where things are going, you have to collect a lot of signal, and so that's what I do: wake up, collect signal, and iterate in my mind, and then build a thing, proof of concept, and see if it works. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that aligns with what you said earlier about it being a very interdisciplinary field.
Yeah.
We are trying to bridge the gap between these different disciplines. I imagine a lot of it is in that creative space. When you collect a lot of signal, get inspiration from a lot of places, you can get those unconventional solutions that you need to problems that maybe aren't super well defined, because they're kind of bridging problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and you kind of brought up a great point, or implying a great point, which is a lot of it is you're kind of just limited to the experiences around yourself. And so in collecting signal, you're kind of broadening that. So you're right, that inspiration can come from the software world, can come from the more industrial, classical automation world, for manufacturing. It can come from some other thing. And so I think you never know. And so I've definitely had those moments where I'm just browsing, and then at one point I'm reading this line on a paper, and I'm yes, this makes sense.
Where has that point been my whole life or my whole career? Okay.
So that's and sometimes it's there's a trickle down effect, right? So things that are in one industry are eventually going to make their way into another, and it's just a matter of reduction of cost or implementation details, things like that. So it's always good to keep an eye out on anything potentially new. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned, one of the first things you do when you get to the office is, you open up Jira, you see what tickets have been filed, if there are any fires, then you participate in stand-ups. I'm curious, is the lab automation, engineering role in organizations typically more of a kind of independent role where you're sort of the expert that other teams call upon, or are you generally part of a tribe of lab automation engineers and you're working together to solve organizational problems?
I mean, it varies. I think I've heard a variety of different structures. I think you have teams that are narrowly focused on specific problems, so support, reliability engineering, continuous improvement, development, R&D, and so it really can vary from structure to structure. I like to kind of so at my previous work, it was we had big production systems processing tons of material, and so we had Jira and we had tickets, and so that's come in. You're a junior engineer and you're eager to make an impact and honestly collect signal in the lab, and so that's kind of where these tickets are really great. So I can let the other engineers work on other things, and I can kind of get to know the instruments, get to know the hardware, ask questions, from all of my friends in the service industry. Thank you, by the way. You guys are the real backbone. And, basically, hopefully in the long run, the idea was that I'll learn a thing or two that can allow me then to make a meaningful change in whatever we were experiencing, or whatever problem. And so, it's always nice to collect signal.
So I might be totally off on this, but the couple of folks that I've spoken to with lab automation experience, they talk about how because it's this interdisciplinary field, you don't get as much maybe, career, counseling and guidance as you might in other sort of maybe more traditional or established fields. And, you're in a lot of ways like having to make it up as you go along because it's a new field. I'm curious, as you run into other lab automation engineers, do you feel that there's a sense of camaraderie among you? And is there like knowledge sharing among like, hey, here's how I managed to get around, whether it's a technical problem or even a management problem, right? Because you're often put in these challenging situations. Do you find that sense of camaraderie, or is it pretty like, hey, we all have our IP and we're siloed and, we don't really prefer to talk and share secrets?
I think some things are kind of fundamentally universal. People problems are pretty universal. And so, to your initial point, right, this whole, that was the experiment of the Bay Area Lab Automators. That was when I put the first event together, I was a wreck. I think the day of, I was just so nervous. And bless my wife, she was a champ. But I said, what if 20 people show up, that's a success, because that's at least, great. It's going to be a great 20 people, have excellent conversation, and we're going to talk about our experiences, and who knows, right? Let's see what this becomes. And what I found over the course of about a year and a half now, I think I want to say, heading into about a year and a half, lots of excellent camaraderie. Lots of people, both junior and senior, who even at the director level, who want to have these conversations, and maybe they're they don't have anybody at the company who kind of really understands this interdisciplinary role, but you can turn to another automation engineer, and there isn't any bridge work. We understand that sometimes the unique challenges that we have to face. And so we can start from that standpoint of this mutual shared experience and then kind of build off of that. So I found an incredibly diverse and open community, and people are happy to share what's worked, what hasn't worked for them, because at the end of the day, I think you never know where you're going to end up. You never know who can help you out in the future, who you can call in a pinch and things like that. And so there was the Bay Area Lab Automators, I think, has shown that there was a need for such a community. Don't just leave it to the conferences, and if you're thinking about starting one locally, just put it together, see who shows up. Even if it's 5 people, that's better than 0. Mm-hmm. And then it can really kind of help you feel like you're not alone. Mm-hmm. So a big part of what I also noticed is that people really want mentorship, and it's really hard to find. Mm-hmm. So they kind of get that through community, and to get it through community, you have to build it first. So and for me, that was kind of one of the things that I wish I had when I first transitioned. Somebody I could talk to, somebody I could just say, like, how do you navigate this? And so when I became senior enough, and I guess had enough clout, as the young kids say, I decided to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And so that's what the Bay Area Lab Automators is all about. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a community. We get together, we build things, we do hackathons, and we integrate ourselves with other networking groups who are in software, AI, and hardware. And so it's just not only network, but also collect broader signals. Yeah.
Well, I'm grateful. Please thank your wife for giving you the activation energy and the momentum to push through.
Sometimes you need that nudge. Yeah. Yeah. I like that activation energy. Yeah.
I think one thing that I've seen that I've appreciated in you and how you've shown up and created community is consistency. And so, my sense is that you are, obviously already career-wise in it for the long haul. And my sense is community-wise also in it, and really building kind of deep established community. And, whether on one given day 5 people show up, and another day 100 show up, like you're still happy because you are creating that momentum. I might be wrong, but that's the sense that I get. And as somebody who is looking for community and looking to deepen my understanding, it's really nice to know that I can sort of always show up and there's somebody there who knows my name and is willing to share some knowledge with me.
Yeah, and you know, on that note, I think like you don't know yet who you don't know, I guess is a way to say it. But if you show up to an event, you know, I always encourage people, it's their first time at an event, they're like, I'm really nervous, I don't know what to do. You can always begin with 2 simple questions, which is, what's your name and what brings you here? You know, and then that you can follow it up with, well, you know, what are you working on? Oh, that's interesting. Can you tell me more? And when I first started networking, before I had the Lab Automators, Bay Area Lab Automators, the first couple of times it was pretty nerve-wracking to go up to a stranger and say, you know, my name is Luis. You know, what brings you here? But then after a while, you kind of get used to it, and you just never know what you're going to hear. And there are things that people are working on, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, that are just the future. And you get to hear about it today. And it's really exciting. And so, I encourage people to go to networking events. Just, give yourself a tiny goal. Talk to 3, talk to 5 new people. So you see a group of people, insert yourself. Somebody will naturally ask you who you are, what do you do, what brings you here. And then, who knows? Maybe you'll meet your best friend. Maybe you'll meet your startup partner, your co-founder. Maybe you'll find a new job, or maybe you'll find a community, and that's really the goal, right? So, and communities need to be consistently available to people. So that's also part of the challenge. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you breaking it down to just introduce yourself and ask why you're here. As a way of just lowering the bar and, again, getting folks to show up, because those can be really intimidating events. I would say once you've done that a few times and you're at Luis level, then I think one thing that you do that I really appreciate is that you remember what I told you or what somebody else told you that they were doing or interested in, and then in that same evening, you then at some point will tap me on the shoulder or somebody else and say, hey, you need to talk to this person because they're also interested in this thing. Yeah. And that's where some extra addition of magic happens. Of course, not every event is going to have Luis, but I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think some people might charge a introduction fee on that.
Oh no! Am I going to get an invoice? Is there one waiting for me?
No. Yeah, I think that's the best part. I mean, connecting the dots, right? So if we want to advance what we're doing in this industry and broadly in biology, you need to have all the different corners of these giant biotech companies in the same room talking to each other. And so when I started Bay Area Lab Automators, my 2023 goal was, let's see who shows up. Let's get people out of their lab caves and into some other location where we can just kind of be ourselves and just hang out and geek out and nerd out. And then year 2 was, hey, there's a lot of biotech activity or tech bio activity in the Bay. Like, people are building software or writing these AI tools or building these models or doing this science, and they talk a lot about automation, but there's no automation engineers here except for maybe me and one other person. And so let me bridge the gap, let me host events. And so that was one of my biggest goals for 2024, which is to bridge the gap with the hardware community, the sciences community, the tech bio community, and the AI community. And so we've been able to host events with a lot of these communities on purpose, because the goal is you talk to somebody and they say, oh, I didn't know that was a problem. I might have a solution. And then that's kind of how you then build the products and things that we'll need moving forward. Yeah.
So speaking of all the different players, I was doing just some research into the lab automation market, and it surprised me in that it was more expansive than I had initially thought. Mm-hmm. So one, I would say, framework that I've seen is basically you can break it down into hardware and software. So on the hardware, there are things like automated liquid handlers, automated plate handlers, robotic arms, automated storage and retrieval systems. On the software side, there's laboratory information management systems, electronic lab notebooks, scientific data management systems, and so forth. Is that a good framework to think about the lab automation kind of market? What do you like to use?
I think, this is a good question. When people ask me what is lab automation, I tend to say, all of the above. Because workflow automation could include data handling, could include LIMS. Doesn't just necessarily have to be hardware. I know automation engineers who don't touch hardware at all, for example. They just focus on applications or something like that. And so, I think all of that, anything that reduces manual touch points, I think can be considered lab automation. And I would also kind of challenge traditional notions of where people draw the lines. I'd say every lab has some form of lab automation. They just take it for granted, right? You're not doing, I'm sure in 1985 or 86, somebody saw this PCR machine and was like, oh no, I'm gonna do it the old fashioned way and manually do it's like, yeah, good luck, So all labs are automated to an extent, and each challenge requires maybe, phase appropriate introduction of more equipment or, data wrangling. So I know automation teams that have handled all of the above. They've done the LIMS scoping and building. They've done the data pipelines. They build the software that the company relies on. And so I think because of that, lab automation has been able to evolve and continues to evolve. So I think one of the things that I've been seeing a lot lately is lab automation, automation scientists, right? So now this automation scientist falls under lab automation, and so they're doing work with robotics in some way, or doing the data pipeline work, or doing the bridge work, and so that's kind of interesting, right? And then so the next thing that I'm seeing a lot lately, especially this year, is lab automation, software engineer, and so they're working in the lab automation team, but they're writing software, and some people might be sticklers or about that delineation, but I think all of the above is where what I would consider lab automation, and I think that's why I hope that we're in a future where the first 5-10 people that are hired, one of them is a lab automation engineer. That's my hope. In the same way that if you have a company today, maybe your third or fourth hire might be a software person. I think lab automation's that's kind of the future we're heading towards. Now, there's a lot implicit in that assumption, but yes, that's kind of the goal, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that speaks to the interdisciplinary nature of what you were describing of lab automation, and that the boundaries are kind of permeable. And as the field evolves and the way in which science happens evolves, more and more stuff seems to be getting sucked under the umbrella, which imagine in some ways can be really exciting, because that means that you're always having to learn. There's probably new types of career opportunities that one hadn't thought of that now fall under the umbrella. That maybe then explains why I also had trouble trying to pin down the size of the lab automation market. So I was, again, looking online. There was a report by a company called Mortar Intelligence. They pinned the market at around $6 billion, which seemed kind of smallish compared to the $100 billion that U.S. pharma spends annually in R&D. On the other hand, I see companies like Tecan, which I hear a lot in the automation space. They have revenues north of $1 billion. There's these juggernauts like Thermo Fisher Scientific. Yeah. They have revenues of over $40 billion. So I guess when you think about the lab automation market, is it a juggernaut? Is it kind of a niche bespoke market that's struggling to make a name for itself, and the business model's not great? How do we make sense of this market?
Oof, yeah. I mean you brought up the numbers. I think when people think of lab automation, they probably think of traditional hardware, and I probably would say that yes, obviously that's one part of it, but it's much broader. So Thermo Scientific, for example, doesn't just sell you hardware; they also sell you the software solutions for that hardware, and then an entire maybe cloud ecosystem for that. And I think just look at how those companies are sometimes structured. A lot of that will fall under their lab automation, digitalization initiatives. And so people, I guess, they're trying to more and more these days sell you an ecosystem of lab automation, not just the hardware. It's, we have all of these solutions, including your infrastructure setup, and that's becoming, I think, more commonplace. This is a great question. I can't really speak to the market, but Thermo's alone way much bigger than $6 billion. So I guess I'd have to see more about this report. I wonder if they just focused on like certain specifics, like maybe they just took hardware sales and removed consumable sales and other things like that. So, but all of that is still, I would consider under the domain of lab automation.
So would you if you're a founder looking to start your next company, or maybe one of those folks who's coming to one of your events and runs into a co-founder, and somebody's like, I got a lab automation startup idea, and maybe it's software, maybe it's hardware. Is this a tough industry to make a buck in? Is it a great industry to make a buck in? Like, I worked in SaaS before, right? Like the margins on software as a service are notoriously good. You look in the heyday of like social networks, like Facebook and so forth, right? Like they basically print money through the model that they have. Where does lab automation fit on that spectrum of just like how easy it is to build and scale up profitable businesses?
I guess it really hardware is tough, I would say. One thing I've learned from the hardware community in San Francisco and my experiences with other engineers in this industry is that people have very high expectations, because you have this great idea, you've built a prototype, but having a product that you've developed versus something that is reliable, has withstood the test of time, those are two different things sometimes. So what you need, and heard this coined phrase, I think by Jim Sturtevant of Artel, where he said, what we need is more lab automation champions, people who are willing to take on that risk to help these young companies develop new platforms or to iterate on whatever they have already so that they can reach a wider market. And so I think initially it's really hard, but if you can find a really great champion, I think a champion can really make you highly successful. In terms of margins, hardware is just tough. People want to buy a machine at the lowest price possible. They don't want extra consumables. They want on-site service the next day if something goes wrong, and that's really hard. And I wish more people kind of understood those business models, and maybe why, if you really want top-notch service, you really want top-notch hardware, you may have to pay a little bit more. Or, SaaS, great example, right? Subscription services of some kind. And I know that's a big no-no in industry, but really, if you really want those next generation solutions, if you really want that hardware to do this extra thing or two, how do we fund that? That's a real challenge. So I think hardware in general is always a tough sell as an industry, unless you're doing something incredibly niche in manufacturing, you're selling tons of it, or you're a first mover and you have that first mover advantage. But eventually, people catch up. So that's kind of the tough part. So like, if you're doing software, then your overhead's a lot lower to begin with, but then you really have to talk to people, and you really have to make that plug and play into whatever ecosystem that they have. They want to do it with minimal resources, with minimal work, and the problem with that challenge is that it's N+1. Each lab is different. This is a different set of infrastructure. And so you need to really do your research and talk to people, and try to make it as easy as possible for both the software engineer and the scientist to interact or utilize your tool. But it's hard. It's hard even for these big companies like Meta and Google to really take that on. So, yeah.
Does that explain why, one of the feedback that I hear is around when you're trying to create maybe more autonomous labs is, hey, we got all of these data islands, all of these systems are really like locked up, proprietary, hard to program. They use these different programming languages. They're almost built not to be interoperable, it seems like. And part of me in the back of my mind is like, maybe that's part of the business model, right? Is like, because it's hard to make a buck, you really want to lock folks into your ecosystem so that you can, make up for all of the R&D costs and the hardware costs that were required to just deliver the product in the first place. So do you see a strong linkage between kind of the openness of these systems and the business model, or no?
Can vary from hardware to hardware, from company to company, and whatever the philosophy that they have. There are companies who are trying to make it easier, trying to make it more open. They launch with robust APIs or a Python interface or a REST server or something like that. And so I feel personally, in my experience over the last 5 years, 8 years, is that I'm starting to see more and more of the complete solution eventually arising. So you have the hardware, and it's like we just need the hardware out, and then we're gonna release the APIs later, and then they eventually come. And I'm seeing a lot of that more, which is fantastic. But there's a gap, right? You need a return. Maybe you have a deadline, some business model, some calculation made that you need to start selling these units to then fund the next wave of development work. And so that happens actually quite a lot more now. And so I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know how much of it, and so in that regard, yes, you want some sort of horizontal, some sort of vertical, and maybe it's a consumable, maybe it's a license for a software that accompanies it. It really just depends on kind of how that company's doing, and whether you're trying to break into the market more, you may lean more towards, we're just going to give you complete access to this hardware because we want you to just take a chance on us. Where if you're a more established player and you have sort of business critical, secure, federal government level contracts, then you need to really kind of focus on security and other things. So that's a much tougher and different ask. Yeah, it can vary.
Okay, I hadn't thought about that security connection, which is when you make things more open. I guess not necessarily, right? I think maybe one of the claims of open source is, hey, if you can see the code, then you can see where the bugs are, right? And potentially find those ahead of time. But I guess there's a balance, because maybe before other people find them, somebody like an adversary might be able to exploit them.
I also want to just chime in and say that there's there's the business model and the calculation that each business makes, and that can be just unique to them, and that's it. And then there's the other answer, which is if there's hardware and if there's software, it can be hacked. And so you can we can hack it. So
we can find ways around this.
So one of the biggest shout out to PyLab Robot, but they basically were able to build around other libraries that were able to do things and talk to existing hardware and software, and other people have also been doing the same, and people have been doing that for forever, pretty much, across all industries, where it's like, this isn't giving us the functionality that we want, so let's just look at the firmware and see what it's doing, see what it's saying. Maybe we can kind of upload our own or something. So these aren't new things. I think that they're just slowly making their way now to lab automation. I think a part of that's just because now we have a wider set of eyes and brains, looking at us and saying, that's really cool, maybe that's what I want to do. And so now you're attracting kind of new talent pools, which is really interesting.
Okay. Well, talk about creative problem solving. So so if you like to hack things, right, and pull things apart and see how they're working, it sounds like that skill set is really rewarded in this field, because sometimes you want machines to do things that they're not able to do right out of the box.
Yeah, but if you're a vendor, think about that, and launching with a pretty robust API will prevent some of that work, because I think the other part of it too is a lot of the hardware that you get goes through a validation process, and it's secure and safe for a narrow scope of possibilities. So if you talk to the firmware, you can really break some things. So a lot of the reasons people talk to the firmware is because they would just want more functionality out of their instrument than what's provided. They want to integrate it into something else. So I think it's like, if as vendors provide better APIs and better interfaces, you might see less of this, or until then it'll be more hacking, and also part of it is, if you have legacy equipment that you can buy for relatively cheap, why not just hack it? And then suddenly it's like brand new again. So, yeah.
So one of the things that I'm excited about with lab automation is the way in which it can accelerate like the drug discovery process. So again, doing some research online, I've got sort of a draft of what that process looks like. I'll link it in the video for folks who are interested in. Please poke holes in it. But just to go through it sort of chronologically. So from the like preclinical development, so like before human trials, you figure out what disease you're trying to solve for. You identify a biological target that influences this disease. That could be a molecule, for example, protein, RNA, DNA. You identify a lead, so a small molecule or biological lead that can modulate this target in some ways. You validate that lead. You do I have the acronym ADME, but a study basically at how well the drug is absorbed, distributed within the body, metabolized, and excreted. You test its toxicology, right? Every drug, from as I understand it, has these kind of natural side effects, and sometimes they can be really toxic, and does the toxicity outweigh the benefits, for example, of that drug? There's an iterative loop here of kind of research and discovery. At some point, you develop a formulation. Maybe it can be injectable, something that's taken orally. You then compile the required data to justify moving into clinical trials. And then there is the whole phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial process, at which point you then submit the drug for regulatory approval. If you then get the thumbs up, you then move into manufacturing said drug, and there's actually phase 4 trials, which, as I understand it, is assessing and surveying how this drug's actually performing in the wild, learning from that and continuing to improve the process. So as you take that whole very long,
very expensive
process, which parts of this process like jump out at you as being sort of the richest area for lab automation to contribute to?
Oof, wow. The richest, I think the manufacturing side, obviously, you've spent a lot of time and money and resources developing this drug, and you got it through trials, or you're getting it through trials. And I think manufacturing is where you can really kind of make some of that cost back. Now, there's an upfront cost, obviously, with automating anything, but then once you've automated it, you can automate it and optimize it in a way so that you reduce the amount of money that it takes to then create that drug product. And you can do it faster, better, more efficient, much more traceable, and you're reducing the kind of the manual touch points, which can introduce errors. So my manufacturing answer, my manufacturing background tells me that manufacturing is definitely one of the areas where lab automation can really contribute. Because the other part of it too is like you need to get the drug products to the people, and sometimes that is itself a challenge. So even something like Ozempic has manufacturing problems, right? So and there are a lot of really non-vain reasons to take Ozempic. I think that's sort of where it can help. And I think the contrarian answer is a lot of people think that automation and R&D don't mix, and I have to totally disagree with that. I think automation can really help with R&D and can really inform R&D, and especially if you're a startup with minimal amount of money, and you are thinking of how you can iterate faster, right? I was seeing, take a little detour, but I was seeing this paper that was posted yesterday that was about how people can use robotic simulations to simulate 10,000 years or 1,000 years of robotic learning in simulation. And so where is that moment for research? Well, maybe we can't do that in silico yet. I know very smart people are working at it in the Bay, but you could do that maybe with your throughput and the amount of experiments that you can kind of run and iterate on. And so I think that's we can't get there yet in silico, but we can do it today maybe with automation. That's my idea. Yeah. So I'm a big proponent of R&D and automation should be best friends, rather than we're too in the weeds with R&D. Once we get to something more stable, then we'll bring in automation. But I don't know. I guess I'm a contrarian in that sense. Yeah.
So let's, so you mentioned R&D. You said your first answer is manufacturing. Double clicking on the manufacturing bit. So I didn't appreciate, I would say, the importance of reducing, for example, manufacturing costs until I was looking at some of the material on the website of your current employer, Cellares. And so they are involved in manufacturing cell therapies. So some examples of those could be like engineered T cells to fight cancer, stem cell therapies for regenerative medicine. I'm saying broadly speaking. I don't know if Cellares is manufacturing those specifically. But the idea is that these cell therapies are actually pretty expensive. And by being expensive, they then become cost prohibitive for folks. Already we know we pay a lot for healthcare in the United States. As you go to emerging countries, I was born in North Africa, where we're just lucky to have some foreign reserves in our central bank to be able to then purchase these for citizens there becomes a real challenging proposition. And so if you can develop new technologies that really reduce these manufacturing costs through, for example, automation, you have real human impacts that are really positive and beneficial. So maybe just double clicking on that, can you tell us a bit more about what is difficult? What are the challenges with specifically manufacturing cell therapies, which again seem really promising and exciting?
Yeah. So I come from an NGS background, high throughput environment, made the pivot to cell therapies, which really came into prominence, I think, right as I was graduating undergrad. And so, is relatively new to me. And I just had no idea how bad it was, I would say. So you had parts of it that were sort of automated and you had some kind of solutions, but they still required a lot of manual touch points. And I think more importantly for me, there was still a lot of like superstition around, how we perform or do or communicate science. And so things that, like people massage bags and do all sorts of other things. And I think when you have a first principles mindset, you kind of ask whether this is, what is this step? What are we really doing? What is the context of this action? And so, it's just a lot of manual touch points. Number two, these are living cells. So you have to subject them to a wide variety of stressful things and not stress them out. And then you have to let them grow. You can't really, you can help accelerate that, but not really. And so they can take a while. And so, manual touch points, things that are living, things that need to be not stressed out. You have to be consistent. You have to make sure that you don't do errors, and it's highly manual, which means errors. We're human. And that's just the drug product manufacturing. You have to then do release testing. And so that's a whole other set of assays and pain points, and it's all regulated. It's all so it has to be totally traceable and sterile and clean, and it's a challenge. It's been a big challenge, and I think that's kind of why you've had a lot of players in the space recently who are trying to solve parts of it or solve the whole thing, and I'm working on just a small little part of that. So it's working with living things. Definitely a lot harder than, hey, I need to break apart this cell and read what's in there, in my opinion. So yeah.
Wow, when folks are leaning on superstition, especially in the sciences, maybe are hard.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's like a rough word. I think it's more, sometimes you need to ask deeper questions about why we're performing certain acts, right? So if you have a manual process and you're vortexing, and why do you vortex? Like, I don't know, that's just what I learned in grad school. And so, vortex it, shake it up, agitate it. But it doesn't tell you anything about what's actually happening in the tube and what the purpose of that is, and whether there's a better fit for purpose instrument. So just stuff like that, I think, is really challenging, and it's a big part of what we do. So when you think about lab automation, people think, oh, you write aspirate dispense commands, but really, I would say that's like a 10% kind of job. really the 90% that's really hard is what is the context? What are we doing? How do we design this? What are we optimizing for? So a lot of creativity, a lot of design decisions, and really a lot of first principles questions, really trying to get to, whether even this is the best assay for whatever question we're trying to solve. So I think another part of what automation engineers should do that they maybe don't practice as much is, keep an eye on, go to these conferences and see what new assays are in your field. See if there's anything in the pipeline, anything interesting. I feel like a good assay, a much better assay, will outperform even the best hardware that's working on an older, much tougher assay. And so, all of that's part of being a great automation engineer, in my opinion. And so, cell therapies, I think they launched, and since then there's just been so much work, autologous, allogenic, in vivo. It's just, there's a lot of diversity, and it has a pretty good success rate in clinical trials, so people are optimistic. It's just the manufacturing has always been a challenge. So you have a really good solution, but if you can't scale it and you can't manufacture it, we don't want to fund it. So we're hoping to fix that.
Okay, you got your work cut out for you. So earlier you said, hey, manufacturing is clearly a great natural fit and a rich place for lab automation. At the same time, let's not forget R&D. I think you were adamant that is an important area where it can really be a contributor. And so to that end, one of the things I'm seeing is the rise of these autonomous or self-driving labs, sometimes called closed loop labs. As an example of just some of the recent activity in this, University of Toronto has now created something called the Acceleration Consortium, which received a historic $200 million grant in order to really set up this center where they dive deep into setting up autonomous labs across disciplines, from biology to materials. UC Berkeley, up the street here, has developed their A lab or autonomous lab. They use inorganic powders, that's right, your alma mater, as the starting ingredient to synthesize materials predicted by its AI models, with the intention of then analyzing them and updating those AI models as it creates these materials. The congressionally chartered National Academies in April of this year hosted a workshop on AI and automated labs for biotechnology. And then I was recently speaking with somebody at ARPA-E who told me about their new catalchemy, I think that's the way you're supposed to pronounce it, a $35 million initiative to leverage AI and autonomous labs to develop next-generation industrial catalysts, I think with a focus on sustainability and energy. So what do you make of all of this activity, especially in the last, I think everything here has happened in the last year or so, and real investment into this thing of autonomous labs? And maybe actually before we even ask you to answer that question, maybe first let's start off with, how do you define autonomous labs, and how is that different from lab automation?
Yeah, so it's sort of you have AI, and then you have subsets within AI, but AI is such a broad term, and so sometimes you read a book and you're like, what kind of AI are you talking about? Be specific. And so we just kind of take that for granted. So I think self-driving labs are a form of lab automation, and it's just a new subset, one that I think definitely existed before the pandemic, and people were already building these sort of closed loop systems to do specific tasks. But I think since the pandemic, people saw the success of automation during that period at scaling up vaccines, and they sort of maybe started looking and thinking about, can we apply this elsewhere? And so I personally feel like that's why you're seeing that more and more these days. So I think as people talk about it more, as they publish papers on it, as you now have a new sort of, that first mover advantage leads to more opportunities as people kind of build and build and build on top of that work. And so part of that is a global conversation right now around lab automation and hardware that's enabling these sorts of technologies. So where you see that a lot is material sciences. That's a really big one. Battery technology is massive, also because the opportunity there is just huge, right? So the better materials, the better IP, the more funding, and so it makes total sense right now that this is kind of where it's going. So lab automation, broad subject, can include software and other things as well. Autonomous labs also include software, but I think the component is you're pairing some sort of augmented decision maker with your robotic platform. Could be AI, could be a very complicated set of if-else statements, which some people might say just AI. But that's how I just, would categorize. So usually it's like robotic platform with a artificial intelligence component that's maybe it's being supervised by a human, and it's arriving and testing and iterating and making decisions and so forth. Yeah.
Okay. So two of the drivers that you mentioned, one is, hey, for like batteries and such, it's a way for us to accelerate research and create maybe better batteries with maybe better properties. You also mentioned that the pandemic opened our eyes to how things can be automated in positive ways, and maybe this is a natural extension of that. So earlier this year, I spent some time talking to a bunch of experts in kind of the autonomous lab space, yourself included, and some of the other drivers that they had mentioned were things like helping organizations to be more financially lean. So helping kind of highly paid scientists spend less time on rote trial and error type work, and more time on maybe some of the more sort of connecting the dots, creative.
Which is happening. Sorry for interrupting. That's happening at what stage? R&D, right?
There we go. Validation. You mentioned breakthrough materials. I saw a recurring answer around reproducibility, how there's a reproducibility crisis in science, and so having more of these kind of autonomous labs can help us make scientific discovery more reproducible, can also help us adhere to current and future regulatory compliance standards, with compliance being built in, I think is one thing that you had mentioned when we chatted. And then there's also this recurring or emerging sort of conversation around national security. So earlier this year, the U.S. House passed the Biosecure Act, which focused on restricting U.S. businesses with Chinese contract research organizations, Wuxi AppTech being one of them. And there's an idea that autonomous labs, by bringing more of that sort of R&D type work here, it prevents kind of leakage of IP to other countries and helps secure our supply chain. So as I throw a few more reasons that I've heard from other folks and just from journals and stuff, I guess what jumps out at you, or what do you make of them?
Oh, yeah. So first and foremost, the national security thing. I mean, onshoring is not just we're not just having this conversation in terms of biotech IP, semiconductors, chips right now. I think the pandemic again, kind of once global supply chains were disrupted, people were suddenly realizing that maybe these are national security issues. So when I talk to investors or founders who are visiting San Francisco and they have these ideas and they come here and I said, these aren't just ideas, these are also national security issues, and you should really go back to your countries and kind of raise that red flag as well, because you don't know how disruptive certain things can be until they're disrupted, and then suddenly, as we saw during the pandemic, there were shortages of lots of items during in not just chips and things like that, but also consumables in the lab, just really basics. So first and foremost, I think that totally makes sense to me that this is a national security issue. And then number two, your IP is everything, and you should probably protect that. So whether I've heard competing things. I think if you're a startup who has minimal resources and you're relying on these CROs, international CROs, I definitely feel for you, and I definitely think that's a net negative, because it is really expensive to then pivot and do it here. But it is also a great opportunity, and also I think safety, not just in terms of IP, but also biosecurity. I think that's one of the biggest hot button items today. As we develop better, faster, more iterative tools, and people can print their own sequences or something, make their own proteins now. It's this is now just a broader security conversation that's occurring, and maybe I think some of those earlier conversations that happened around recombinant DNA and CRISPR. Like, I think people are kind of rehaving that and resurfacing that because it is a massive concern. So, yeah, I definitely, I'm a beneficiary if you can bring manufacturing home. I think that's great. That's my personal feeling about it. But we do also live in a globalized world, and so I understand that's really difficult and impossible for certain countries or researchers who may not have that infrastructure. On the other hand, if you build your own self-driving or autonomous lab, or you build something that's really abstracted, nobody's going to be more invested in iterating on your work than yourself, period. Even if you have, I think, the best CRO or whatever, you can be 22 hours a day type of person and just iterate. You don't have to wait for a conversation or data or have these like tricky IP conversations sometimes. And so I think that's one of the biggest advantages, that you get to control your fate. I think people kind of can take that for granted. Now, other things I think are really hard to do, like if you're doing mouse work, it's really tough at scale. So that's a harder conversation that I don't know anything about, but I've just heard from people. Yeah, so it really varies. I think that self-driving or autonomous labs are part of that, solving that problem, but I think it's like a sliver of that. I think it's also more around, we're in a data-hungry world, and you just need to generate a ton of data. You have these in silico models, you have these ideas, you got to test them. And automation is just going to do it better, faster, 24/7, and be more traceable. So I think that's kind of the biggest reason, in my opinion, why you would want to build your own self-driving lab, especially if you're in like an early research company. And you can do it at a budget. It doesn't have to be something super crazy or ridiculous. Like there's ways to build cheap self-driving labs. Yeah.
Well, one of my, and maybe this is being overly, rosy-eyed or whatever the term is, optimistic, but if we, succeed in bringing more of this work, domestically through lab automation, maybe as we develop these automated lab technologies, we then have blueprints that we can then share with other countries to then build that kind of capacity domestically.
Yeah, that's true. I also think that the other part of this conversation is, as people do more work here and they build more infrastructure, they're publishing their setups, they're publishing their repos, they're publishing how they're setting up the infrastructure. And so other people can learn from that. So now you're starting from instead of starting from nowhere, you're starting from here now. And then now you can just iterate on top of that. And then eventually I think, we'll have these beautiful infrastructure diagrams and that you can just maybe watch on YouTube, and self-driving lab influencer might, here's our self-driving back end, whatever. So
there you go. That would pair really well with your TikTok video about day in the life of an automated lab.
Well, it happens in software. In software, there's always like this. I was a Google engineer. Here's our software back end. This is how we manage traffic in these, for websites. And so, if you're like a young infrastructure guy, you're like, oh, I'll watch it and learn some things. Why did you pick this software over this? And so we don't do that enough yet, but I think that's going to change. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned investors and red flags. As a community organizer and as somebody who's been to a bunch of events with you now, often they involve some sort of a pitch. As you listen to pitches related to lab automation, what gets you really excited and what raises red flags in your eyes?
Ooh. Yeah, I'm pretty. I tend to be an optimist. I feel like, if it's really easy to be critical. It's really easy to kind of feel pessimistic, but I tend to be optimistic. So I don't really look for too many red flags. Like they just kind of become explicit, and it can vary from pitch to pitch. But I will say two things that I definitely am acutely aware of is what problem are you trying to solve? And like, what is your track record, right? And I think those two things really matter. So if you're going for something ambitious and you have an excellent track record, like maybe we should talk, right? And I can connect you to people. If you're going for something that's maybe a low-hanging fruit and you don't have a track record, I'd like to see, early stage prototype or something functional. So I think those are sort of the trade-offs you have to make. If you have a track record and a crazy idea, I'll connect you to people. And I think we are kind of living in a time and a period right now where tough hardware problems are becoming more mainstream, and investors are kind of adjusting their expectations for what we now consider or call deep tech, right? So those are going to be much longer timelines, but they will be very rewarding. It's not going to be we build something one year and next year we have 10 clients, $100 million in revenue. That's generally not how it works. And so, it's like really tough hardware logistics problems. I think those are kind of becoming more popular. And we actually had our first deep tech week last year. And the first event of deep tech week was my lab automation, one of the lab automation AI hackathons. So we're excited. That was pretty cool. And I think investors are looking for both solutions now. So it's like you need to have a longer timeline for some of these things, some of these tough problems. Yeah.
Well, I appreciated that event. I was participating in that. And got to play with my first Opentrons, Flex machine, and was part of a team of a lot of folks who are from the biotech space, and got to be, shoulder to shoulder with them for a couple of days. Yeah. And we hacked something together, which the PM for Opentrons said, "Oh, that's actually on our list of things to accomplish in our long list." But nonetheless, we'd also thought of this.
That's great.
And so when you talk about a track record, maybe it's a small data point, but it's a data point nonetheless. And so events like that are really, I think, cool ways for one to start building that portfolio of things that they can point to and say, hey, here's what I built. It's not just kind of a pie in the sky deal.
Let me just say 2 quick notes about that. And I'm going to just shout you out because I think you put together the best, probably, deck that I've ever seen at a hackathon. So talk to him. But it was incredible. I was just like, what is going, this is professional. So number one. Number two, I think there's this misconception that, it's a hackathon, I need to be a hacker. I need to no, the best people are the people that come in knowing nothing. They're learning, they're asking questions, they're iterating, and they're walking away hopefully learning a lot more. Maybe an understanding that maybe I'm here and I need to be here. So, and hackathons are they're work, man. I'm in the trenches with people, going over their designs, talking things through. I like to call it jamming because I love Fig Jam. I'm jamming with people left and right all day, and so I'm just as exhausted at the end of it as everybody else. But they're a great opportunity to learn, to kind of pick other people's brains to see how they think, and also you mentioned how do you asked this question potentially how do you get into lab automation? Come to hackathons, build things. That's how you show initiative. That's how you show activity. That's how you build a portfolio.
Amen. Well,
I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great, and it just brings to reality a lot of the stuff that I read and I talk about.
I think we had a couple people show up who were like, I know nothing about lab automation or biotech, but I have these skills, and then they walk out of it and they're just like, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And so, really cool AR technologies, things like schedule optimization. People, and other things. I think you never know. You never know who you're going to meet. You might discover that this was a need, and there's your startup. So we'll see.
There you go. All right. So bringing this conversation home, I got a couple last questions for you. So one, I'm going to make you, king for a day, queen for a day, or wizard for a day. If you had a magic wand, how would you accelerate lab automation?
Ooh, how would I accelerate it?
And this could include not just maybe hardware and technically. It could be better training resources, better career pathways and models. Anything goes.
Yeah. I think resources. We're starting to collectively, as an industry, kind of put more resources out there, kind of make ourselves more present. We have a forum and a Discord, and LinkedIn and Blue Sky accounts and all that. And I think the more we talk, the more we create these awesome resources, and so people can learn on their own rather than hoping to learn on the job. And you empower the individual to build up their skill set as much as they want and build their own portfolio to make that transition instead of relying on the old way of doing things, which is what I had to do. And I thought you miss out on so much great talent because somebody's a gatekeeper in some way. So that's here's all these resources, and then people can kind of just learn on their own. Yeah. So that's what I would also like. I understand that companies don't want to reveal their secret sauce, but if I were a young engineer today, I would start with Opentrons and just see like what can I build on my own. They put everything out there, and so if you can simulate your own script, that's a great place to start. And I wish more companies kind of did that. So yeah.
Well, that's a good segue to my last question, which is there are folks who are listening to this podcast, watching this podcast, who have resources, right? It could be investors, policymakers, engineers, founders, scientists, and so forth. What's one way, Luis, that we can help you in the efforts that you're doing to drive community here?
First and foremost, thanks for the opportunity here to talk to everybody. It's been great. But really show up. Go to a networking event. I think talk to people. Everybody has such a unique expertise that you never know what it's going to lead to, what you're going to get out of it. So go to a networking event. Number 2, be active, contribute in the conversation that we have online. And then number 3, collaborate. I think with the networking community, with these communities that exist across the globe, you have an opportunity to directly reach out to people and have them work with you or work with your product or see it in person. And I think that's always these are engineers at the end of the day. Like they care about, Marshawn Lynch, they're about that action, boss. And that's really what it comes down to. So we're about that action in the Bay Area, and show up, be active, and collaborate. But don't forget to execute. Don't forget to continue building.
Amen. And how do we find Bay Area Lab Automators? How do we find your next events?
Yeah, so we're on LinkedIn, Bay Area Lab Automators. There's going to be a Blue Sky account soon. Secured that. And there's also just a lab automation forum that I want to shout out that you can always contribute to, and you'll find events posted there. But the lab automation community is starting to go global, and so that's kind of that's the goal, that's the idea. And so we're going to continue to keep getting bigger and bigger. And as autonomous labs come online, hopefully there's a wider subset of people who are now being welcomed into our arms. So we're really excited about that. We think automation is the future. So yeah.
Amen. Well, we're going to put all those links into the description of the video so folks can find you and go to your events. Luis Villa, thank you for being a friend, a community organizer, and also just a deep thinker about this space and where it's going, and sharing those insights with us.
Thank you for everything. Thank you for coming to the events. And if you've never gone to one of my events, look what you're missing out on. Look at this. This guy's amazing.
There we go.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cheers, man.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah.